So in the last lecture, we set up our project and we added Bootstrap to it. Now I want to get started adding the components we laid out here. Here's your challenge. Try doing this on your own. Now with that, I don't mean filling these component templates with live. For now, each component may simply hold some dummy text so that we can see that it's there. I mean create the components and try to create a clever folder structure in your app folder. Not every component should have a folder on the root level. You should also nest them by feature maybe. And try to create at least one component manually by hand, not using the CLI. I'll give you a chance to pause the video and then I will show you my approach. Chances are that we deviate in our solution, but that's a good practice for you. So definitely go ahead and try creating these components without any content in it for now on your own. So, were you successful? Let's see how I would solve this, how I would approach this. We got two main areas, recipes in the shopping list, and we got this header component. Now, I will create the header component manually. So for this, we can already start the discussions. Should we create a header folder in the app folder where we store this component? Or should we create the component in the app folder itself? Now I will create a header folder, but placing the component directly in the app folder would also not be wrong, since it is really only used by our app component. So here I will create this new folder named header, and in there I'll add my header.component.ts file. Now, as you learned, a component is simply just a TypeScript class, so let's name it header component here. And right now, that would not be recognized as a component by Angular. Instead, here, we have to add the add component decorator. And later I'm going to use the auto import feature of my IDE. For now, I'll import it manually. We have to import component between curly braces from @Angular core. That's important. Now with that, we need to pass a JavaScript object to this decorator to configure this component. Specifically, we need to add a template, and I'll put this in an external file, so template URL in this case, and a selector so that we can use this component. So the selector here is app header because I want to ensure that I have a unique selector and that I don't override an existing HTML element, for example. And header would be an existing element. The template URL, here I want to point to the header.component.html file. And as you probably recognized, this file doesn't exist. So I can quickly create this by creating a new file in the same folder, in the header folder. Here, header.component.html is the full file name. And in this HTML file here, I simply want to output the header for now. I'm going to add some content soon. So that's my header component. And I can already include this in my app component, maybe above the container, because in the container I later only want to contain my content component, I will say. So here I'll add the app header, just like this. So with that we added it here. Now let's see if we can see it. And I just see loading ... which always is an indicator that there has been an error. So check the JavaScript console in your developer tools to see the error. And the error is pretty clear. App header is not a known element. This is a common gotcha, which is why I wanted to show it. Why is it not known? We added it here and we set up the selector here, right? Well, remember, you have to register all the features you're going to use in the app module. And since we didn't use the CLI to create this component, it wasn't added there automatically. So we have to add it manually to our declarations array. And that means we also have to add the import. So we should import header component from, and now pointing to the header folder, and then in there the header component file without the file extension. So that now unlocks the header component in our app. And if we save this, now we see the header. Now that's not pretty, we're going to change this soon, but we can see that it is working. Now let's move on to adding all the other components with the CLI for now. So we had a couple of components we wanted to add, and I will use the ng generate command, or just ngg as a shortcut. And then we want to generate a component, or just C as a shortcut. And the first component I want to add is the recipes component for this recipes feature area. I'll add spec false to prevent the creation of a testing file, which I don't need. So with that, we get a new folder in our app folder, the recipes folder, which holds our recipes component. That is great. Now, this will be our overall recipes feature component. And that actually is a component I didn't sketch out here. Here we only have recipe list, item, and detail. Now you could also just work with these, but I want to create a setup where I have a list on the left, let's say, and if I click an item, the detail component is displayed on the right. So I will need an overall component holding both. Now that is an optional setup. You can also go with another one where the detail is somehow embedded into the list component. I chose to create this overall component. Now besides that, I will go ahead and create the other components though. So besides recipes, I will also now create the recipe list component as laid out on the slides. Now here, I don't want to create the recipe list on the or inside the app folder though, which is the default behavior by the CLI if I now would hit enter. Instead, that should go inside the recipes folder because that is where all the recipe related components should go. We can easily tell the CLI to create this component in a subfolder by basically passing a path here. So instead of just saying recipe list, we can say recipes/recipe list. And since we already have the recipes folder, this will create the recipes list folder inside of the recipes folder. That is what I meant with structuring the folders by feature. Now with the recipe list added, I also want to add the recipe detail here, because the recipe detail should be displayed next to the list in my setup here. So I will add it to the recipes folder too, so that now we also have the recipe detail folder here. And we also need a component for a single recipe item, right? So recipe item. However, I don't want to add that to the recipes folder. That should go inside the recipe list folder because it's in the recipe list where I want to, well, also have that item. So I'll point to the recipe list subfolder here and now hit enter. And now we got the component inside the recipe list because again, a recipe item is just one item in this list of recipes. Now again, it's only one possible folder structure. You could remove the recipes component and put recipe list component as the main recipe feature component and add detail somewhere in this component then. I chose to have this setup here though. Now let's move on to the shopping list. Well, for this, I'll of course run nggc again to generate a new component, and I name it shopping list. I'll also add spec false here to prevent the creation of this testing file. And this will give me a shopping list folder in my main app folder, so next to recipes and header. Inside the shopping list, there's only one other component I wanted to create, and that's the shopping list added component, which will allow us to add new ingredients or edit existing ones. That should now go into the shopping list component. So just like before with recipes, I'll simply change this to shopping list/shopping added, and this will now add it inside of this component. So now we got all the components we need for now, or at least I think we need for now. Of course, feel free to choose a different setup, but with all these components added, and since we used the CLI, they were also added automatically to app module. If you did create them manually, make sure to add them here too. So with all that created and added to app module, we can now use them. So let's start using them in the next lecture, and let's also start filling them with some life there.